Okay, so thank you so much for being here. This is joint work with Benoit, who is not here, and Raja Jayaraman. And so we just talked about this in the previous presentation, but when we think about immigrants, there's a lot of work showing that a lot of them, especially when they arrive, are ending up kind of like at low-paying firms. So in this paper, we're going to think about whether networks, and specifically immigrant networks, play a role, kind of like in this fact. And this is really early stage work, so any feedback is especially helpful here. So as a motivation, having a good job is a very important part of the immigrant dream. And as we were saying, this is particularly challenging for recently arrived immigrants who might lack, for example, workplace networks in their destination country, or might face several other barriers such as cultural or linguistic barriers when they arrive. And so social network might be helpful in addressing these challenges. And when you think about social network, residential networks are going to be the specific network that we think about, and everyone is going to have a residential network. Everyone is going to live somewhere and is going to, in some way, interact with their neighbors. And there's a lot of literature showing that social networks can be helpful because they might facilitate job search through information sharing. They might provide direct referrals to immigrants, or they might even improve on the job performance. So in this context, identity might be particularly important because peer effects might be mediated by background. And of course, you can think about identity in a bunch of different ways, but what we're really going to think about here is going to be immigrant identity, so immigrants versus natives, and then within immigrants at a more granular level, co-nationals, or people who speak the same language as you, as opposed to other immigrants. So what we're going to do in this paper is we're going to use rich administrative data for the city of Toronto, spanning the period 2001 to 2017. So many of you here might know and work with this data, but this is the matched employer-employee panel data for Canada. And it's going to be linked with immigration records at arrival. And then with this data, we're going to investigate whether immigrants who work in small neighborhoods where like the neighbors work for high-paying firms also get jobs in high-paying firms. And then secondly, we're going to study whether shared identity matters, again, looking at fellow immigrants, immigrants from the same country of birth, and immigrants who share the same language. So of course, when we're thinking about peer effects and networks, selection is going to be a primary concern. So the way we're going to think about it in this paper is pretty standard in the literature, but basically we're going to address selection into residential locations by exploiting variation in small neighborhoods within larger residential locales, and we're going to go into more detail about that. So just to give you a brief preview of our results, we find positive and significant peer effects for working at high-quality firms. And then we find that identity seems to matter. In particular, when we look at our core sample, which is going to be recently arrived immigrants in Canada, we find that immigrant networks exert much stronger influence than native networks for these immigrants. Interestingly, when we change our sample and we look at natives in Toronto, we find that the relative magnitude is going to be much smaller for natives. So natives exert stronger peer effects for natives, but the relative difference with immigrants is much, much smaller. And then going back to immigrants, we're going to find that the peer effects of co-nationals and individuals who speak the same language are significantly larger than those of natives and other immigrants. And this is going to be like 8 times as large, or even more, depending on the specification. In a second exercise, we're going to focus on periods that follow job switches. And here, we're going to find that peer effects in this sample are slightly reduced. And we're going to interpret these as saying that these peer effects are coming from both job finding and job retention. And then finally, we estimate this using pooled OLS. But when we include individual fixed effect, we find that peer effects are about 1/5 of our pooled OLS estimates. And this seems to suggest that, otherwise we would be overestimating kind of these peer effects, but the relative magnitude are going to be unaffected by the inclusion of individual fixed effects. Okay, so thinking about where this work fits in the broader literature, The first literature where we see this kind of fitting is a long line of work on the effect of neighborhood networks on labor market outcomes. And here, our study is going to draw heavily on the work by Bayer and co-authors and Schmutte. And our contribution is really on thinking basically about the differential impact of homophilous social network, and then using this 17-year panel. The second literature where we see our work fit is a broad literature that looks at co-ethnic networks on the labor market outcomes of immigrants, and then in a specific branch of this literature, specifically refugees. And so here, we're going to focus on employment at high-quality firms, and then we're going to be able to construct networks at a much more granular level with respect to both locations at which we measure networks and identity of the immigrants. So this is just a brief overview of what I'm going to talk to you about, but we're going to go over the context and data for our work, and then over our empirical strategy and sample selection, thinking about how we try to address identification, and then how we estimate a firm-specific earning premium and a linear social interactions model, and then showing our main results. So we're going to focus on the Toronto census metropolitan area, and this is a very interesting context, we think, in which to think about immigrant networks, because it's really one of the largest and most diverse populations of first-generation immigrants in the world. According to the last census, more than 40% of the city was born abroad. And then, more specifically, we also have variation in identity at the neighborhood level, so we're able to construct these networks not only for natives versus immigrants, but also by country of birth. So for the data, we're going to use the Canadian employer-employee dynamic database. That's the linked employer-employee data for Canada, where we have the universe of taxpayers linked to their employers. And specifically, we're going to use some demographic characteristics from the data, so age, gender, marital status, and the census metropolitan area of residence to identify Toronto. We will use these employer identifiers and earnings by employer to construct earnings from the main employer during the year. And then this data is also going to give us annual residential postal code at the full level, so at the 6-digit level and at the 3-digit level. And these two are going to be nested within each other. Then these data are going to be linked to the longitudinal immigration database, the IMDb, that gives us, this is basically administrative records that give us information at arrival on immigrants, whether in Canada after 1952, as Adam was saying this morning, but then after 1980 with the full set of characteristics. And so here, we're really going to, first of all, use it to identify immigrants, and then to identify country of birth, mother tongue, and year of arrival, and a set of other characteristics for these immigrants. So thinking about our empirical strategy, as I was mentioning, when we think about networks and peer effects, we have to try to think a bit carefully about identification. There's two major issues for identification of peer effects that have been identified in the literature. So first of all, the reflection problem, and secondly, correlated effects. So when we think about the reflection problem, we're thinking about separately identifying peer effects and contextual effects. So the effects of your peers' outcomes and the effects of your peers' characteristics, for example. So in our context, this is not really a concern because we kind of break simultaneity. First of all, using these firm-specific earnings premium, which depend on the full work histories as our outcome. And secondly, we're going to construct our peer network with a lag. So we're going to break this simultaneity. And then additionally, on a more technical side, we have large variation in group sizes, which has been shown by these two papers, by Lee and then by Bloom and co-authors, to be a sufficient condition for kind of addressing the reflection problem. Secondly, we have correlated effects, and these effects can arise because of sorting. So of course, people are not going to randomly choose where they live in the city. They're going to select into the city, and this might be correlated with their outcomes in the labor market. And secondly, we might have common shocks. So we might have a shock that affects everyone who lives in a certain residential area, and this is going to affect the immigrant that we're looking at and all of their network, right? So this is a problem in our context, and we really need to think about that. So the way that we're going to deal with this is First, using quasi-exogenous variation in residential neighborhoods within larger locales, and I'm going to go into more details about what that means in this context. And secondly, we're going to include locale by year fixed effects and see that it doesn't really affect our results, kind of to address common shocks. So when we're thinking about, so here it is, okay. So let me show you, this is a map of downtown Toronto. This is a large part of our data. And what you see here, these kind of colored shapes are called FSAs according to the postal code system. They correspond to the first 3 digits of the postal code. There's around 180 FSAs in the Toronto Census Metropolitan area. And we're gonna call these locales. So these areas share common feature. They provide similar access to road and transportation networks, similar access to public and private goods and services. So, of course, it's natural to think that people are going to select into all of these locales. They're not going to sort across them in a random way. So, just as an example, you can zoom in into one of them. For example, here, I highlighted for you the annex that corresponds to the first 3 digits of the postal code M5R. If you ever have been to the University of Toronto, that's just the area that's just above it, where a lot of professors and students live. So of course, there is a lot of selection into who lives into this 3-digit postal code. And then this is what 6-digit postal codes look within the annex, right? So this is what we're gonna call a neighborhood. And this is basically a subset of blocks that are nested within these larger locales and are defined by these 6-digit postal codes. And there's around 100,000 in the Toronto CMA. And so the way that the postal code designed these different areas is really for easy postal delivery. So the idea is that really they're kind of like a natural unit in some sense to think about social interactions. They're going to be continuous blocks or sets of houses, basically. And so our idea is really that, of course, there's going to be selection into the larger locales, but that conditional on a locale, the variation across these different, we're going to basically exploit the variation across these kind of like groups of blocks within the locale as they're defined by the 6-digit postal codes. Okay. There you go. All right, so again, thinking about sorting, this is kind of like the assumption that you have to believe for in this strategy that conditional on these 3 digits FSAs, neighborhood choice is plausibly exogenous. So what we're going to do is we're going to, yes?
So that means, on average, your neighborhoods are just 30 people.
So of course, there's going to be a lot of variation in how big kind of these areas are, and arguably, it's true that for some, these are going to be very small areas. So that's, if that's the concern, of course, they could be quite small at the 6-digit level. So one thing we're going to do to try to think about that is to restrict our sample, for example, to 6-digit postal codes where you have, I don't know, at least X numbers of neighbors or X number of immigrants and native neighbors to kind of ensure that this is not driven by meaningless networks. Basically, we're just picking up 1 or 2 people. And the second thing that we're doing right now, but we haven't...
If it's 30 people on average, then what's the share of immigrants in Toronto?
So the share of immigrants in Toronto in this period is about 30%.
So it's about a third of that, that means 10 immigrants.
Yeah, so in some of these, it's going to be even less, for example. Yeah. So in some of these neighborhoods, it's going to be maybe 1 or 2, and then in others, there's going to be many more. It's really distributed depending on the neighborhood. So this is, something that right now, the only way we've thought about it is kind of doing these robustness checks by, for example, ensuring that you have at least 5 other immigrants or at least 5 other people from your same country of birth, for example, when we do that disaggregation. Yeah. But another way that people have done it and that we're trying to do is kind of like building some hexagons just based on distance from a central location where you can play a bit more with kind of these distances and construct different measures. But you cannot do that using the postal code because unfortunately between 3 and 6 the digits are not nested within each other. So yeah, that's something that we're working on. All right, so one way to, the way that we kind of like test, oh yes, sorry.
Is it going to be true that the 6 digits that have more people are going to be disproportionately apartment buildings?
Yes.
The ones that have fewer, and it might be the nature of the interactions and the types of people in those places. Is that going to be important for you?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. We haven't done a lot of heterogeneity yet. This is pretty new, but yeah, that in that sense, like what you're saying is, for example, looking at, I don't know, like more densely populated area versus the rest of the CMA, and yeah, no, that's a good point. I generally we don't see that. So we're going to need to impose like some some restrictions to kind of like construct the networks, but we're going to try to be very minimal in that, just like ensuring that you have at least one person, just like for kind of like baseline estimates. And when we do that, we do see that there is, of course, like the people that we drop are, for example, more likely to be natives or richer. So yeah, that would go in the sense that like they might be different. Yeah. Okay, so we're gonna test this assumption following Beyer and co-authors and Schmute, and basically the way that they do this and that we're going to do it is we're going to select a random individual in each 6-digit neighborhood, and then for each of these individuals, we're going to run univariate regressions where for each characteristic of the individual I, we're going to regress their characteristic on the average characteristic of all of their peers in the 6-digit neighborhood. And then we're going to, in a second step, re-estimate this now including local fixed effects. And so basically the way to think about this is that if there's a lot of sorting, then the average characteristic for your peers should be a good predictor for your characteristics, so the R-squares from these regressions should be very high. But if sorting is accounted for by local fixed effects, then the R-squares should be much lower. Right, so this is what I'm showing you here. These are R-squares from a set of different univariate regressions for each of these characteristics here. And as you can see, there is a lot of sorting across locale. And then in the second column, I'm showing you now the regression when we include local fixed effects. So the R-squares are much lower, much closer to 0, and they're very similar to what Beyer and co-authors and Schmute find in the US. So moving on, this is kind of just like an overview of how we select our sample and our steps for estimation. I'm going to go into more details later, but what we're going to do is we're going to select a sample of immigrants and natives in Toronto from the linked employer-employee data between 2001 and 2017. And on this full sample, we will estimate a AKM-style two-way fixed effect model. And this is really going to be in order to retrieve firm-specific earnings premium, right? So without going into kind of like more detail about what makes it such that they exist. And then we will select a recent cohort of immigrants among this full sample. And for each of the immigrants in this sample, construct their residential network at the 6-digit level. And then we will estimate a standard like linear means social interaction model for this sample. First of all, using the full network, and secondly, disaggregating the network by, for example, fellow immigrants versus natives, or natives versus immigrants from the same country of birth versus other immigrants, and similarly for language.
Can I just ask, so for the AKN, are you using only Toronto or the entire huge labor market around Toronto?
So the way we're doing it right now is basically we're going to use everyone. We're only going to use firms. Well, we're going to use everyone who have either lived or worked. Yes. So the way we thought about dealing with that currently is we're not going to restrict you to be living in the Toronto CMA, but we're going to allow for people, for example, who work in the Toronto CMA in this first kind of like full sample to think about that. But yeah, so maybe we could think about like making this even larger.
If you have the data, I would just estimate that only the entire population of workers in Toronto, no matter where they are coming.
Oh yeah, that's what we're doing. Yeah, sorry. So yeah, we use everyone who either lived or worked in Toronto, no matter where they live. And then we impose the restriction on living only kind of in point 3. So when we really want to construct neighborhoods, that's when we focus in residence. Yes?
How do you know where they work?
So of course, that's a good point. That's a good point. So no, that's a good point. We're just gonna, yes, that's a good point. So for residential, we're able to be much more precise, and then we're not really gonna be able to know where they work. We're gonna be able to know where the kind of like headquarters of the firm that they work for is. So of course, for big firms, that would be definitely a concern. Yeah, that's a good. Thank you. All right, so this is kind of like what we were touching on. So we're starting from the full employer-employee data, and then we're going to impose a set of restrictions. First, we're going to only keep individuals who either work for firms which have headquarters in the Toronto CMA or who resided in the Toronto CMA. Secondly, we're really interested in working-aged individuals, so we're going to impose an age restriction. Third, big limitation of this data is that we don't have any information on hours worked, so we're going to proxy for that using an earnings threshold. And then finally, we want to estimate firm fixed effects, so we're only going to keep individuals employed in the private sector. So on this sample, we will estimate an AKM type two-way fixed effect model where we regress the log of the annual real earnings for a worker from their main employer during the year. On a worker fixed effect, a set of individual time-varied controls, and then a firm fixed effect and year fixed effect. And so what we're really interested in at this stage is to kind of like retrieve this firm-specific earnings premium, which are going to be our outcome in the linear social interaction model. So once we have the sample for which we estimate this firm-specific earning premium, we're going to impose a set of additional restrictions to really focus in on our immigrant sample and construct their network. So first of all, we're really going to be interested in recently arrived immigrants for whom these networks might be particularly important. So we're going to select immigrants who arrived to Canada between 1996 and 2000, so that by 2001, which is the first year in which we observe them, they're going to have at most 5 years of residence. Here, we're only going to select individuals who lived in the Toronto CMA during this period, because we want to, again, be able to construct networks for them in this area. We're going to impose the restriction that in 2001, they were aged 25 to 44, so that by the end of the period, they're still working age. And then we're going to impose two other restrictions that are going to just to enable us to be able basically to construct networks for them. So we're going to ensure that they live in a neighborhood where there's at least two immigrants, one being them and then another one, and one native, so that we're sure that we're able to construct at least a network for everyone. And then that they live in a locale with at least two neighborhoods, so that the identification strategy is meaningful in some way. So this is going to make up our immigrant sample, and then once we have the immigrant sample, we're going to go back to the connected sample, let's say from the AKM style model, and then we're going to retrieve all of the peers for these immigrants, and the peers are going to be all of the individuals who lived in the same 6-digit postal code. And so this is going to be kind of like making up our networks. And then finally, when we're going to disaggregate these networks by country of birth or by mother tongue, we're going to need to impose an additional restriction, which is that we're really going to be focusing on the top 10 countries of birth or top 10 languages, again, to make sure that we can construct networks for most of these individuals. And this is going to be 65% of our sample. So here you can see kind of like the top countries of birth in the period that we're looking at. So these are going to be, for example, India and China and the Philippines are going to be the top, and then Pakistan, Hong Kong, and so on. And so this is going to be 65% of our sample. When we're restricting to top mother tongues, again, we're going to have about 65%. Okay, so on this immigrant sample, we're going to estimate a linear social interaction model. So again, this is a first crack at this. This is the workhorse model in the literature, where basically we, on the left-hand side, we're going to have the pay premium at the firm where immigrant I worked in year T, and this is retrieved from the estimation of the two-way fixed effect model. And we're going to, on the right-hand side, we're going to have the average pay premium for all of their network, right? Where this is going to be all of the individuals who lived in the same 6-digit postal code, and then we're going to take the lag of this average. Right, then we're going to have the lambda LG term here is going to be a local fixed effect, where the local is going to be the 3-digit area that contained the 6-digit neighborhood. And then we're going to have individual level controls. We're going to have the average characteristics of your network, and then a term that's just capturing earning premiums at your previous employer and year fixed effects. So this is just to kind of like set a benchmark, and what we're really going to be interested in is this phi term here that's going to capture the peer effects. But what we're really interested in is going to be to try to disaggregate this network, right? So this is what we're doing here, and basically we're just disaggregating the average of the firm premium and of the characteristics among your peers between the different disaggregation of the network. So for example, when you're looking at the peer effect term, you can think about summing over, for example, fellow immigrants and natives, or natives, immigrants from the same country of birth, and immigrants from other countries of birth. And these are going to be, the average pay premium is going to be weighted by their share in the neighborhood. And so what we're going to be interested in is whether the peer effect from your fellow group, let's say, is going to be higher or not as compared to the peer effect of other members of your network.
So Natalie, why don't you use, I mean, you estimate worker fixed effects, right?
Yes.
So why don't you construct the peer quality in the neighborhood based on the worker fixed effects? Because then you are going to
So you would say, like, instead of the average characteristics.
Yeah.
No, that's a good point. Mm-hmm. That's a good point. Yeah, we haven't done that, but we could do that. So
and that reflects the kind of longer term quality of workers
in your. That's a good point. Yeah. So here, when we have these characteristics, some of these are going to be. I mean, all of them are going to be captured by the worker fixed effect. Some of them are going to be time varying. Some are going to be kind of like characteristics at arrival, for example, of immigrants. But yeah, we could definitely do that. That's a great point. Yeah. Thank you. Yes.
I was imagining the whole time in my mind that the network effect is you're actually working for the same employer. You have the identity of the firms, right? Can you look and see how much of this is just a match at the same employer?
Yeah, so I think that's kind of like a next step that we have in mind, but absolutely. Yeah, so this is, for example, I think, for example, Schmute kind of like gets at that, like, and trying to, well, I guess like it's, when we think about mechanism about like why do we see these peer effects, is it, for example, that this is like just referrals and you kind of like end up working at the same employer? So yeah, that's a great point. No, that's absolutely. We haven't gotten to that yet, but I think that's a natural kind of like next step. Yeah, thank you. Okay, so just showing you some of our preliminary results. So this is, again, just kind of like the benchmark using our full network. So what you see here is this phi, the estimate for the phi, so for the average pay premium for all of your neighbors. In the first column, we only have year fixed effects, and then we have our full set of controls in the second column. And then, so what we're really interested about is going to be...
One other question. So don't you have a big measurement error problem here because of the magnitude of the peer groups you have in your neighborhoods?
So you mean the measurement of the network? Is, yeah, that's a good...
If it's on average, as we just established 10,
Mm-hmm.
that's pretty...
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So because here, even technically, it could be even lower, right? Like we're just imposing that there's at least one. So of course, like there's a big problem. So like just as a technical restriction. So what we do, for example, is at some point we impose, for example, that you have at least 5 or more, and so on. And the estimates are a little bit attenuated, but they're still there, and the relative magnitudes are intact. So yeah, for now, like the way that we dealt with this was this, like trying to impose kind of like increasing thresholds.
So if you did that, for instance, let's say you use the fixed effects of workers
Mm-hmm.
then you could use a simple word correction. So you construct whether in that neighborhood, so you need to have a certain magnitude, say 10.
Yeah.
Whether the average quality is above or below the mean, and you use that discrete variable as an instrument that would actually fix your measurement error.
Okay, I
That's
see.
I mean, people don't read old textbooks, but Johnson, for instance, has emphasized that as a correction for measurement error. And you could do exactly that here.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point. So we could just see if your network is above average or not. Yeah, yeah, no, that's a great idea. But yeah, so keeping in mind that, of course, like we could have this type of issues here. One thing that we find interesting is that when you split the network up between fellow immigrants and native neighbors, so this is going to be columns 3 and 4, and you can look at column 4 for kind of like our estimates, which include our set of controls. Fellow immigrants, the peer effect for fellow immigrants is much, much larger than the peer effect for native neighbors, right? And this is kind of almost 8 times as large. And what we thought was particularly interesting is that when you kind of like switch the sample and look at natives, just to have an idea about how does that compare, if you look at column 4 here, which is kind of like the counterpart to what I just showed you, it's still true that neighbors of, let's say, like your same type are going to have a stronger peer effect. So if you look at native neighbors here, the estimate is larger, but the relative magnitudes are much lower here, right? So it's just about 3 times the size, for example. So thinking now about kind of like disaggregating these identities even further, what I'm showing you here is just the peer effects, so the estimate from column 4 that you just saw. First, you have the full network when we weren't splitting it up, and then for immigrants, the immigrant or native peer effects. And then what we do is we disaggregate the immigrant part between immigrants from the same country of birth or different countries of birth, or immigrants with the same mother tongue or other mother tongues. So again, this is going to be a slightly, well, not slightly, a different sample, because this is going to be 65% of the full sample, because we're going to really be focusing in on these top kind of like 10 countries of birth or languages. But what we show here is that what really seems to matter is whether immigrants from Europe, really like a very granular dimension of identity, have this kind of like high quality jobs. And other immigrants have a positive and significant peer effects, but much, much smaller, and natives actually don't really have a significant peer effect.
So how much of that is due to individuals just being from the same family?
So that's what we're working on right now. So we just got kind of like family identifiers in the tax records, and we're kind of like dropping them right now. We don't have the results yet for them. So when we impose this kind of like increasing thresholds, of course, you can assume that people might have very big families. So even if you impose I don't know, like a 10 plus threshold, it could all still be family, but it's less concerning, let's say. But yeah, we're working towards kind of eliminating everyone who has the same family identifier in the tax records right now.
In your data, you observe the settlement pattern, right? So you know when people came to the area. Now you don't, I think, use that information. So you just construct the neighborhood quality based on who is there and who. But you could use people who have been there before the individual moved there. Then you still have a sorting issue.
Mm-hmm.
But at least you avoid that there is simultaneity in, say, occupational decisions or firm decisions.
Yeah, no, we could use like a lag, not just as compared to the outcome, but just like as compared to the move of the individual. Yeah, no, that's, yeah, right now we're not using any, right now we're really treating kind of like this network formation as static, but of course, this is a dynamic problem. So yeah, we're trying to think about how to take that into account, yeah. And so, what we do next, so the estimates that I showed you were using kind of like pooled OLS. We run a modified version where we don't include kind of like the firm fixed effect at your previous employer using individual fixed effects. And of course, our estimates of peer effects are much attenuated. What remains is really these kind of like relative sizes of the peer effects, where really, when you look at immigrants from the same country of birth or who speak the same mother tongue, peer effects are still much larger than other immigrants and natives. And in this specification, actually, peer effects for other immigrants are not significant. So as a separate exercise, we focus in on periods that follow job switches. So kind of the idea here is that when we're thinking about, and this is kind of like hinting about at the idea that you were talking about, not actually getting at that, but going into that direction. So when we think about the mechanisms here, it could be that these networks help you get information about your jobs, or they could help you, for example, improve your performance on the job and improve retention of good jobs. So we don't really know that from our kind of like main estimates. So what we try to do here is that we focus in on periods that follow job switches. And what we see is that our estimates in this sample are much smaller. So the relative sizes are still the same, but our estimate is about 40% of the one for the full sample. And the way we interpret this is that this might suggest a role for not just job search, but also peer effects helping you in improving job retention at very good firms. All right, so we do some robustness checks. We, for example, restrict the sample to immigrants who have 5 or more peers or other thresholds, although we haven't vetted that yet from the RDC, and we still find the same effect. They're a little bit smaller, but they're still there. Again, to try to get a kind of meaningful network, still using the imperfect kind of postal code data that we have right now. Then we try to use world region of birth instead of country of birth. This allows us to not restrict our attention to this 65% sample of top countries, but really look at everyone. We still find a stronger peer effect for immigrants from your same world region, although it's attenuated, suggesting that it's a more granular level of identity that matters here. And then we try to think about common shocks by, for example, including locale by year fixed effects, thinking about these shocks that might affect everyone in a certain locale, or thinking about country of birth by year fixed effects. And we see that our results are virtually identical when we include these fixed effects. And so just to conclude, I think I'm almost out of time. So just to recap, we use this rich administrative data for Toronto to study whether immigrants whose neighbors work for high-paying firms also work at such firms. And we do that exploiting quasi-exogenous variation in very small neighborhoods within larger locales. So we've discussed, we find positive peer effects, and these peer effects are much stronger for fellow immigrants as compared to immigrant neighbors, to native neighbors. And then when we zoom in on these immigrant neighbors, we find that peer effects are much, much larger for co-nationals than for other immigrants. And then finally, when we, again, focus on switchers, we find attenuated effects suggesting that these peer effects might act through both job finding and retention. And finally, including fixed effects might suggest that without the inclusion of worker fixed effects, we might be overestimating the size of these peer effects. So thanks a lot for all of the comments. I'm going to leave the stage to Dave for your discussion.
I'm discussing this paper by Benoit, Natalia, Raj, and I'm Decio Coviello. A disclaimer, I'm not an expert in the topic, I'm not expert of the data, but I hope I can at least summarize what they did and try to give some angle. Where are you, Natalia? And not sure you want to follow all the comments that I'm giving, so take it with a grain of salt. So what's the paper about? Well, broadly speaking, the paper aims at estimating neighbor effects and understand, what are the neighbors that may have an effect on these workers. And specifically, because of the data we will understand later, they will take the angle of immigrants And the kind of the deeper question that they're asking in the paper is to understand not only if there are neighbor effects, but also what are the specific characteristics of the neighbors that they may have this effect and they matter for the workers. So, I mean, as Natalia said, there are at least two difficulties in answering this classical question on peer effects and neighbor effects. The first is a reflection problem. Basically, individuals and neighbors' outcomes are endogenously determined, therefore there is a circularity. The second problem, there is a correlated effect problem, meaning that pay premium are determined by the choice of the neighbor, and this correlates with observable characteristics. Okay, so the paper, in a way, I think Natalia already presented clearly, adopts a smart solution. I think the smartest solution to begin with is the database that has a lot of variation and a lot of detailed information to try to fix at least these two problems. So as they explain in the paper, they fix the reflection problem, the circularity, using the first stage estimate from the HEC model. To fix the correlated effects problem, they use this idea that in Canada we have within localities, we have micro areas, and there is a sort of randomness in which exact neighbor you locate. Okay, so they don't say that it's random the locality, but within the locality there is some randomness, and they make some tests to try to convince that's the case, and I like that a lot. So let's go back a bit to the specification, what they exactly do. They estimate a kind of a two-stage model or two-stage approach. In the first stage, they estimate what is known as to be a wage equation with a la AKM, meaning they estimate phi k that is at the firm effect using the variation in IT, and basically so they estimate the pay premium to work in a given firm, and then they take that phi, they take the predicted phi, and they go in equation 2. Okay, in equation 2, they basically regress the pay premium for an individual at time t on this phi c, I guess, bar jt minus 1, and they add locality fixed effect, they add x bar, and phi tilde it. And actually, that's something I would like to remark here. In a way, the model is not really static because psi, so I'm mixing phi and psi. This is psi, if I remember from Greek. Daniel, you studied Greek, yes, if I remember? Phi is the one like this, round, and psi, right? I'm on my own, okay. Even on Greek? Okay, so so basically equation 2 is dynamic in my opinion, especially because there is basically the earning premium lagged, and in this case it's not just lagged in terms of time, it's lagged in terms of previous job. And the equation, at least in this version, does not include any worker fixed effect, right? Because there is nothing I in the equation 2. Equation 1 has worker fixed effect. I'll come back to that later, but this is basically something not very new, I think, if I understand. What is a bit new in the project is to try to split psi and try to look at difference within these neighbors and try to say, for example, if nationality matter and things like that. They basically decompose that, okay? Again, also this equation has no fixed effect. And so far, so good. I think, I mean, some comments have been raised before, so I don't want to repeat them. These are the results, okay? So basically, they show that there is a big effect in blue when they estimate equation 2 with OLS, okay? Not taking in consideration worker fixed effect. So basically, native neighbors, they have a much bigger premium. And mother tongue matters a lot. Okay, so these are these two big things here. And in orange, these are the same effects when they put worker fixed effect. Okay, so as Natalia said, the effect go down. They are much smaller. So I mean, the draft is still preliminary, and I'm not an expert in the literature. It would be nice to remark more what's the difference between your estimate and the one in the literature. both the OLS and the fixed effect. In the paper, you make a nice discussion that you kind of play with that. So, but I didn't get if 0.8 is big. I sense it's big, and given that it's not in, would be nice to know more. The kind of things I would like to say, so that if I go in my comments, start finally my discussion, there are 3 things I would like to say. The first is about the sample construction. You know, when you like a project, like in this case, you always want to know more, and so I was wondering why you only focus on Toronto. In Canada, there are at least 2 other big cities, Montreal and Calgary. Maybe you can repeat the exercise there. There may be some interesting dynamic there as well. I mean, yes, maybe there is some homogeneity in Montreal, but still it's a city full of immigrants, including me. And so the second one is more about this fixed effect. Maybe because I am kind of the generation trained with the Johnston book that was mentioned before. If in equation 2 or 3 you add the worker fixed effect, you have a substantial bias by a dynamic model, right? And no matter how big is your sample, in this case it's very big, you're gonna get the estimates of phi with a bias. And so the concern I have is that you kind of discuss a lot the difference between the OLS and the fixed effect for some reason. Of course, the variation is different, but I was wondering whether this bias is what's driving your result. Remember, because you have a dynamic term here, it's psi tilde, and this is actually out of switching from jobs. So it's even more complex because actually relate to the first estimate. I think equation 1, you estimate psi out of variation from companies, and now you write in AKM style, now you bring it down and you put worker fixed effect. So I was kind of wondering how much this bias it's affecting, but maybe it doesn't, so don't worry, just maybe nobody will ever ask you again, so it's all the stuff. But it's what motivates the literature on dynamic panels. Okay. Yeah, I don't know if you want to answer, but it's a question. And then exactly, so I am a bit again being of that generation trained, like the lag of phi. It's a good trick, maybe it works, but then people can ask you why not lag 2, why not lag 3, and the decision of the lag sometimes is kind of, of course, it maybe technically may help you with identification because you can derive the condition for identification, but then, so why not, given that you are using lags, and given that this is already lagged 1, and this is lagged 1 basically, despite what is written, then why not instrumenting with lag 2, kind of using classical instrument coming from the past, and maybe actually you can try to instrument that and with the past characteristics. And basically I'm done. And just to conclude, I think it's a very interesting question. The data are extremely good, as we know, and the results, I mean, you did a lot of robustness check and you presented them well. And I think that's it. Thank you.